Passage. Short story contribution for Orthology Light by Anita Kovacevic, inspired by a passage in Zagreb, Croatia's capital. Part 2. Ophelia was barely 16 when her dear mother died, and her father considered his daughter nothing but a burden in his life of debauchery. One evening, as he gambled away another portion of his wealth to Bacchus, he shouted at Ophelia to play the piano and sing for them. Her fragile silhouette slid along the room without a sound, and her pale face, trimmed with raven-black hair and sparkling with sapphire eyes, caught the attention of Bacchus. He grabbed her hand in passing, holding her wrist till it turned blue, and his hungry gaze made her blood freeze. As she quickly turned from a burden to an asset, her father promised her as wife to Lord Bacchus, breaking her heart. Later that night she cried and begged her father to release her of the promise, but he was only too happy to loot his daughter and keep his house. At the mere dawn of her life, Ophelia became payment of debt. On the first morning of her marriage, Ophelia regained consciousness on the floor of their extravagant bedroom, lying amidst the blood-crusted pieces of her torn wedding dress. Her head pounded, still echoing with her own screams, which had ricocheted back and forth against the thick walls of the bedroom on their wedding night, as she had become intimately acquainted with her beastly husband's fists and appetite. His violent grin floated before her eyes, with the haunting promise of all that was yet to come. She tried calling for help, but her voice was too weak to carry any sound. Trapped like a canary in a golden birdcage, she gathered her feathers and managed to rise. Her eyes scanned the room in panic, relieved that her husband had long been gone on business. The silvery bathtub was prepared in the corner of the room. She didn't wash herself. She couldn't bear even her own touch for the pain. She just sat in the water till it turned as cold as ice. Then she put on her mother's pale yellow dress and covered her bruises with a matching silk scarf. As Ophelia started to wander the mansion, desperate to find help, servants avoided her gaze and shut the doors before her in fear for their lives. Gold and threat had always been Bacchus's powerful allies. The guards at the main door had been given strict instructions not to let her out of the estate by any means necessary, and they followed the orders to the letter. So the poor canary climbed up to the tallest tower and sat at the window, lost and alone. Music had always been her solace. Perhaps that was the reason she started to sing, an old tune her mother used to sing to her when Ophelia needed solace. There she sat till her husband's shouting announced his return. The first night she tried to remain in the tower, he took out his rage on the cook and her children. The following evening, and every other evening since, Ophelia would descend her tower and be the wife Bacchus expected. While she had respite on Sundays, when her husband went hunting, the tower remained a refuge for her songs and unheard prayers. James heard her over the wall. As he worked in his house in silence, copying scrolls and documents, his house would fill with that fairy-like voice, and he fell in love with that sound of sadness and longing, innocence and childhood, long before he'd even learned it was hers. He too had sorrows to tell, and he recognized the pain from the first notes that reached him. James had learned all about suffering at the hands of his stepfather. When he was 5, his mother did her best to save her son's life by taking refuge behind the city church. Going to morning mass, the bishop found her on the doorstep, lying next to little James. They had both been beaten, starved, and felt terrified. James's tormentor soon died of liver failure after drinking away his fortune. His mother joined the monastery, finding peace and solace in chores and prayer. James grew up in the abbey orphanage, and the bishop became his patron, urging him to excel at his studies and skills. James was now in his early 20s, never ordained, but well educated and hard-working. The bishop employed him as a scribe, and readily recommended his services to wealthy lords. But James still remembered how pain sounded. Ophelia was only 17, but the horrors she had known were already worth a lifetime of nightmares. To be continued.